Julieanna Richardson is the founder and visionary of the HistoryMakers, the largest collection of African-American video oral history in the world. The collection, housed at the Library of Congress and growing every day, chronicles the life stories of African-Americans who have made their mark on everything from culture to business and philanthropy. Ms. Richardson joins us today to talk about this amazing collection. I've heard you say, Julianna, that you don't know always where history lies. What did that statement mean to you when you first said it?
I mean exactly what I said, because you don't know. Like, I remember when we were first starting the project, and and people didn't know us, and so we were trying to balance off between well-known and unsung. And I was going to interview a man named Colonel Bill Thompson, and I knew he was a Tuskegee Airman. But I had great doubt going there. And when I, knocked on the door, there was magic there. So he had been the chief documentarian for the Tuskegee Airmen, and a lot of his things are in the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum, as well as the Tuskegee Museum in Detroit. And so he had boxes that he had prepared for us, and he sits me down and he says, "Have you heard of the Golden 13? And I said, "No, Colonel Thompson, I've never heard of the Golden 13. He said, "Well, there are 4 left living in the country. They're the Navy's version of the Tuskegee Airmen. There are 4 left living in the country. One lives."
I've never heard of them before.
And he said he wants to talk to you also. So that story led to me being seated next to General Colin Powell, and who I was really targeting for an interview. I was, chatting him up, and he was telling me no, he was taken care of. And then I told him my Colonel Thompson story, and then he told me about the Montfort Point Marines, who were the Marines version of the Tuskegee Airmen. So when you think of it, we only hear of the Tuskegee Airmen, but all 3 branches, the Montfort Point Marine, the Navy's, the Golden 13, and the Tuskegee Airmen, are the time where we're integrating U.S. Armed Forces. And so that's what I mean by that. You never know where history lies.
Give us a sense of the span of the stories that you've collected over the years. First off, how many of these histories have you collected thus far?
We're at approximately 3,400, recorded in 413 cities and towns across the United States. The average length of the interview is 3 to 4 hours in length. Our oldest history maker at the time of interview was 109. She died at 114, Louisiana Hines, who was a World War II Rosie the Riveter. The youngest, Aisha McMillan, is a prima ballerina from North Carolina. So the subjects are vast. I mean, it's from every discipline. We haven't yet reached every part of the United States, but that is our goal. I often tell people around COVID, we were deciding that we were going to do research outlines that trace the history of Blacks in the military, or the history of Black lawyers, the history of Blacks in medicine. And so as part of that, on one of our calls, I was saying, Montana has like really rich Black history.
Montana?
And so I know I made that statement, but one of our researchers really didn't believe me. And, he was working on our civics outline, and he brought in photos one morning saying, you were right. There were all kinds of photos, but around 1930s, it starts changing, to the Montana that we know today. But yeah, Black people are all over. We've traveled to, Alaska and Hawaii. Both of those histories go back to the 1800s. In fact, in Alaska, I'm so proud to say, I'm so proud of my Black Alaska HistoryMaker group, because, we went through the museum. They have a wonderful museum in Anchorage world-class museum. But I noticed that there were no Black people in the museum, but they took the challenge, and now there's an 8,500 square foot, excellently curated exhibit dedicated to the lives of Black Alaskans and their history.
Wow. You have partnered with the Library of Congress. How did that relationship come to be, and what exactly does it do?
So the Library of Congress serves as our permanent repository. We're in the largest facility for AV material built anywhere in the world. We're in their facility in Culpeper. The facility was built with the largest gift to date to the federal government of $163 million donated by David Packard, who loves moving image archives. And so there are films going back to the beginning of film in the United States. So that's where we're housed. The other thing that's significant about the Library of Congress and where we're housed is that we're the largest attempt to record the Black experience since the WPA slave narratives. Between the years of 1936 and 38, there were 2,300 formerly enslaved interviewed. And so the fact that in the Library of Congress are the stories of the formerly enslaved and the stories of the descendants of the formerly enslaved. As we were preparing, because it was a lot of work, we had to digitize everything before we delivered it. And I remember, like the exhaustion, but waking up on vacation and it was like 3 o'clock in the morning, that's where the WPA slave narrative. So I wasn't thinking about that because we're in the video section. But in terms of how that came about, there's a man named James Linder who actually has become a friend, but he's an expert in moving image archives. And so he visited, and I was like, what am I doing with all this material? It was like all over. And, he sits me down and he goes, so did you think about adding other things to the collection? Or, and he was challenging me on, I didn't think big enough. And I'm like, I'm suffocating on thinking big. But as he got up to leave, he said that this collection belongs in the Library of Congress. So he made the call for us. And then I went and visited several times, and then we entered into an agreement. Yeah.
When you began that relationship, that was in the midst of the work that you do every day in trying to collect these stories. What are the close calls you've had where it is that you were able to capture a story before the person went away, and it just really added to the richness of the entire collection?
I'm sure there's several stories like that. The one that comes immediately to mind, but there's several like that because we've also lost people. We just lost James Mtume, who's a famous musician, and we were scheduled to do his interview, and his son had arranged, and then the crew was in New York, and they said, he had been hospitalized, so we never got his story. But I would say, one of the ones that come to mind, but there are quite a few of them, and but one of them that comes to mind is Jesse Norman. And we had gone to over a series of maybe 3 visits to visit her in her apartment in New York. She died about maybe 6-7 months later. But there are several examples of that, of people that we just got in the nick of time. One person that also comes to mind is Eartha Kitt. These are vocalists, by the way, but we had honored her. And I didn't know Eartha Kitt. I didn't know. I had heard in the process that she had had cancer, and she came with her daughter, and she's, this tall. And she came out on that stage kicking her leg up at 80 something years old. I mean, wearing a slit up. And there was no way in my mind that, because that was like September, and then she died on Christmas Day, when the song she's known for is Santa Baby. I mean, it's just, like magical instances. Like, I really felt that she had chosen us. I mean, in some, odd way. So,
you talk about, when she passed away and being able to capture that. You've also said that if we lose the 20th century, we lose everything.
yeah.
What is it that you're racing against right now?
Okay, so I started out to tell people stories. I was tremendously impacted by the lack of knowledge of my own history, because I grew up in a small coal mining town called Duquesne, Pennsylvania. And then I moved when I was age 9, after my father retired from the military, from the Army, to a town called Newark, Ohio, which there were 1,000 Blacks out of 50,000 whites. And the only thing we studied were about Black people were slavery and George Washington Carver and his peanuts in my hometown. And I just couldn't believe, like, my teachers were like, he could do anything with peanuts. And then, you see these pictures of us being enslaved. Those two facts didn't compute. So I wanted to change that. So I was tremendously, as I said, influenced by that and wanted to change it.
You talked about how you have you're racing to capture the 20th.
So, okay. So what happened? So we start out to record these stories, and then it just so happened, maybe about a decade ago, thank you, Scott, that I started to ask people, what they were doing with their papers. And I was concerned because even well-known people weren't doing anything about their papers. And when I mean papers, I'm talking about letters, correspondence, photographs, the things that tell the story. Now, we had obviously, I think it was, we interviewed Julian in the fall of 2000. We start doing interviews in February of 2000. By the fall of 2000, we're in Washington, D.C., interviewing him. And I'd asked him, that was the first person I asked to bring photos to the interview. And he came with those photos, and it took me back to my childhood self, because he had those curly, we all fell in love, all the young girls and the older women fell in love with Julian and his girls. So I started to realize that that the 20th century was really not recorded. I didn't really realize that to probably starting a decade ago. I had found my history in New York Schomburg Library. I knew about the Amistad. They're real, Tuskegee, Howard University. Mamie Clayton. They're really rich repositories, some better preserved than others, but they're rich repositories. I didn't realize that almost no library, museum, archive have the presence of Black people. And I used to talk about the urgency, with people in the Jewish community. There were debates, some people said, the Holocaust was really urgent. I said, well, it's urgent also with the Black community. And so there was that feeling of urgency that, I needed to record people, I needed to get to them before, time passed. But now I'm like, there's a new immediate urgency, because I just didn't understand how little we are documented. We've lost the 17th,
Mm-hmm.
the 18th, and 19th centuries. We can ill afford to lose the 20th.
I was going to say that in describing your observations, it almost sounds similar. You mentioned the Holocaust. It almost sounds a bit reminiscent of the Shoah project in some ways. Is there any relationship there between their process and how that's informed how you approach this process?
Well, it's an interesting thing. I mean, as I started to talk about the project, I went to a Jewish university, Brandeis University, and that's a lot of where my project began, where I was doing research on the Harlem Renaissance. But as I started to, do the project, because I wrote first a concept paper instead of a business plan, because people were asking me, how I was going to pull this off. And so people started talking about the Shoah Foundation. So I contacted them. They weren't responsive to the beginning, but I actually ended up going to visit Shoah very early in the project. They were on the Universal lot right next to DreamWorks. And they had, at that time, they were sort of winding down their interview operations. They had interviewed 52,000 Holocaust survivors in 5 years. And they, there were very interesting things about it, like they would have people fill out a 40-page questionnaire, So the concept of a questionnaire came from that. So we have a very close working relationship over the years, even past changing executive directors. In fact, over a period of time, like maybe within the last 5 years, I went and, spent 2 days with them. They have a man there named Sam Guzman, who I consider a brilliant technologist. And so, things like FedEx, shipped all their things all over the world. And then by the time it came to us, there was no possibility for shipping. But they've been really informative. We take delight in each other's work. I was looking at them from a fundraising perspective, but yeah, we have a close working relationship.
I'm curious, with this, just huge collection and growing every day, how would you like ultimately this collection used?
To educate the world about the Black experience, to raise the cultural equity of the Black community, to show the diversity and depth and beauty of the Black community, the strength, to diversify how we're shown, to give. I want the collection to be relevant for the child who's not yet born. And I would like us to be a beacon for other lost American stories who got sort of lost in the melting pot.
Interesting. I'm curious, when you talk about all these stories, there's been a saying for the past 20 years or so in media that content is king. And you've got content and then some. If you were giving advice right now to the head of Netflix or HBO on stories that just have to be told, that would be fantastic. And I know it's difficult, but could you pick 2 or 3 that you'd say, oh yeah, this needs to be a movie or a series. This individual needs to be highlighted?
I don't know if I'll be able to answer that question because there's so many stories in the collection, and I'll try to think of them. But I want to start with Katherine Johnson, who we interviewed, who Hidden Figures was featured in. Now, to me, that I never would have thought that story would have come out of our, that would be the story that would come out of our collection. It didn't come out of our collection, they independently. But that would be a groundbreaking movie that lots of people were like, I never even knew that history. We have so many stories like that. I mean, there are thousands of stories of families and communities. I mean, there's one of my early interviews, and I just have a fondness for this, is Catherine Dunham, who create a Black dance for this country. When I went to interview her, she was living in an assisted living care apartment. The Belafontes had moved her to New York. Julie Belafonte had been, who was white, had been a Catherine Dunham dancer. And she started in the 1930s. What was really fascinating is that she was half Canadian, her mother half Canadian, and the father was 20 years younger than the mother. And they were two Taylor brothers. He was part of the two Taylors in downtown Chicago. She, her legs were insured, I think for $25,000 when she starred in Cabin in the Sky. She traveled the world with 40 dancers in her dance troupe with no grant money. She was just really fascinating in all of her work that she did, her formative work that she did in Haiti as she was doing her PhD and graduating with it in anthropology from the University of Chicago. There's so many stories. I could sort of go on and on, but there are a lot of stories in there about.
Well, let me try this one then. Who has been your most difficult get in terms of getting to have them sit down with you, and the most satisfying once you did?
Well, okay, we did him as an evening with, but I wrote to Berry Gordy for every year for 14 years. I mean, every year. And the interesting thing is that I had actually traveled to Detroit to meet with Esther Gordy, and I chuckled with her niece, Robin Terry, who's now heading up the Motown Museum, because there was Esther seated with her nephew and another relative on the other side. And I'm pitching. I mean, I'm really, trying to say I want a partner. I don't really have a pot to piss in, really, at that point, when you think about it, and she's sitting there very politely saying yes and no at the same time. And so I never got her interview. And then I really, if it not been for, I wrote to Berry Gordy, every year. And then there were times when it was no, then it became maybe, then it became possibly, then it became maybe no, maybe no, maybe no. And then they finally said yes. And
Fantastic.
so that was really quite wonderful. I also think of, I'm sure that James Earl Jones, we had written to a lot. I had become fascinated because I'd been hearing that his father was also an actor, and James Earl Jones didn't really grow up with his father, but they both had the actor gene, and the part that his father always wanted to play was Othello. So when James got the chance to play Othello, which he played 4 times, he always was falling in love with his Desdemonas, and I think he married 2 of them. But he, his father was like instructing him. They sort of got into a heated argument over Othello. But that was, was really lovely. He came with his son to the interview, and then, he was like the best man at the wedding of Elizabeth Taylor, so that was, it's so nice.
That is, wow. That is quite a story. I wanted to ask you in our final moments, I know that we can see some of the history makers on the PBS app and that you've partnered with PBS in the past, but where is it that we should go in order to enjoy more of these stories?
Well, our website is www.thehistorymakers.org, but we would encourage your viewers to become digital makers, and then you can see all 11,000 interviews through our digital archive, which Carnegie Mellon helped us build. And all of that material is there, searchable by just keywords. It's really all transcribed, all searchable. You can put in a keyword and it'll take you any place within the collection.
And we're going to have to leave it there. Julieanna Richardson, thank you so much for joining us, and we wish you well in your work.
Thank you so much.
And that's our show. Thanks to our guests, and thanks to you for watching Studio Sacramento. I'm Scott Syphax. See you next time right here on KVIE. All episodes of Studio Sacramento, along with other KVIE programs, are available to watch online at kvie.org/video.